In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to correctly save assemblies in Modo. This process isn't particularly well documented, so it's actually very easy to trip up. I'm going to show you two cases. The first is a very simple case where I've just got a bunch of items and maybe some textures that I want to save out as an assembly. So in this case, it's just the lighting and the environment of this scene that I want to save as an assembly so that I can reuse it in a different scene. And the second case I'm going to show you is going to be much more complex because in this case I've got a rig, a pretty complicated rig that I want to save out as an assembly so that I can reload it into scenes. It's basically this softbox which you're probably familiar with because it comes with the standard content in Modo 801. So I'm going to show you the steps that I needed to go through in order for me to save this assembly so that you could then reuse it in your scenes. So if we go back to the simplest scene, I'll show you how to save out the lights and the environment so that they can be successfully reloaded into another scene. So in order to save my assembly, what I need to do is to start by selecting the items that I want to save. So I'm going to hold down Control and select both the items, which is the two lights. But I also need to make sure that everything that is related to these items is also selected when I save my assembly. So in this case, it's any materials or textures which are associated with the items I have selected. Now, if I go to the shader tree and look in the lights folder and expand the actual lights, you can see that the light materials and this constant texture are not selected. And this is a really easy way to trip up, because if I was to save this assembly now, it would be incomplete because the lights would come in without the materials and textures. So I need to hold down Control and select all the extra stuff to make sure that that gets saved with my assembly. I'm now going to expand the environment and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to select the environment and the environment material. Now, if I was selecting other types of items that had materials associated with them, I'd also have to make sure to select everything relating to those materials, including things like texture locators, etc., with my item selection in order to successfully save the assembly. And now that I'm confident that I've got everything that I need selected, I'm going to return to the item list because this step needs to be done from the item list. And I'm going to right click over one of the selected items and I'm going to go Save Assembly. Now the folder that you choose needs to be a folder that you're going to later point your preset browser to, so just be aware of that. And I'm going to call it Sunlight. Save that. And now if I open my preset browser by hitting F6, it's already pointing to this folder, but if in your case you've saved it somewhere that your preset browser is not pointing to, simply click on the add path and then point your preset browser to the relevant folder. So what I'm going to do is just check that my sunlight.lxp is there, and there it is. So in order to put it to the test, I'm simply going to delete all of the lighting and the environment in this scene and reload it from the preset browser. So with all my items still selected, I'm simply going to right click over one of them in the item list and I'm going to select delete from the menu and say yes to everything. And if I now open a preview window, you can see it's completely black because I've got no lights in the scene and my environment material has been deleted, so my environment is black. And if I now hit F6 once again to open my preset browser and simply double click on the sunlight.lxp preset that I saved, you can see that it's brought everything back in. My lights are in with all the textures. I've got an environment here, and what I need to do is simply select the old black environment, delete that from the scene. And if I now hit F8 to open my preview window, you can see that all my lighting has come in successfully. So you can see that saving a basic assembly is pretty straightforward. The only thing you really need to be aware of is to make sure that you select everything that needs to be included in the assembly before you save it. As a final step, I'm going to add an icon to the assembly that I've just saved in order to make it easier to identify when I'm scrolling through the preset browser. So I've done a very quick render of the scene. If I open the render window, you'll see. What I'm going to do is open my preset browser once again, locate the Sunlight assembly, and I'm going to right click on it and go replace icon with last render. And when I do this, you can see that it places the last render in the frame buffer as the icon for my assembly. And this is just going to make it easier to find in the future. So having covered the simple assembly, let's close this scene and move on to the more complex assemblies. This is going to require a completely different method of saving the assembly. This time I'm going to need to save the assembly from the schematic view, and I'll show you why, because if you don't save it from the schematic view, you're going to get a very messy result. I'm going to demonstrate the kind of problems you're likely to encounter if you try and save this more complex kind of assembly via the item list. And by complex, I mean an assembly that has a rig that's built with a nodal network. So let me select the top level folder that everything is contained within, and I'm just going to double click on it to select the entire hierarchy. Now I'm going to go to the shader tree, and I need to select all the materials that are associated with the assembly I want to save. So if I hold down the Shift key while I expand this softbox folder, it should expand the entire thing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down Shift to select the entire group of the shader folder. Now at this point I should be, in theory, ready to save my assembly, but there's going to be a few problems, and I'm going to demonstrate these. Let me just hold down Shift and expand the entire item list hierarchy, and you can see there's a plus sign over this item here. Now if I expand that, you can see there's a rotation constraint here, and that is not selected. So already I'm going to run into problems. But let's just try and be thorough, and let's expand all these little plus signs, and by holding down Control, let's select all of these as well. And just to double check, I'm also going to go into my shader tree, and I'm going to make sure that everything is selected here. In my shader tree, everything is successfully selected, but let me right click here and go to Save Assembly, and we'll call this Test Softbox. So I'm just going to quickly restore my item list, and I'm going to hit spacebar to drop all my selections, and let me just collapse this group. And now I'm going to open a new scene, or create a new scene, hit F6 to open my preset browser, and I'm going to locate my test softbox .lxp preset, which I've just saved. So let's double click on that to load the softbox into the scene. So at this point, the first thing I'm going to do is to open a preview window by hitting F8, and straight away I can see that something is amiss. This is not what the softbox is supposed to look like. If I go back to the original scene, you can see this is how the softbox should look. Yet in this scene, I've got this. And the reason for this is basically because the rig is broken. And there's another problem as well. If I try and locate the nodes that control the rig, you'll see that they're a complete mess. Basically, all of the nodes have come in one on top of each other. So it's going to be really hard to do any editing on this nodal network. Let me just expand this. You can see that there's basically just a huge stack of nodes all stacked on top of each other. So it's pretty much impossible to do any kind of editing here without doing damage. It would take quite a long time to separate everything out, whereas my original nodal network was pretty tidy. It looked like this. So what's caused this, and what can I do about it? Well, the cause of the problem is actually pretty straightforward. I can demonstrate it very simply. If I double click on the top level folder to select the entire hierarchy, and then let me just shift click to expand everything, go through and select all of this stuff, and then do the same in the shader tree. So let's hold down Shift and go down to the bottom, Shift. So now in theory I've got everything selected, yet if I expand the schematic view, you can see everything that's selected is in blue, but actually it's not everything. There's quite a few nodes here that aren't selected. Now, why would that be? Well, the reason is actually pretty straightforward. It's simply because some of these nodes haven't ended up in this hierarchy. So how does this happen? Well, it's very simple to demonstrate. Let me just select this item here, and now I'll just go and add any kind of modifier. Let's add a conditional. Okay, so I add that to the schematic, and look what happens in the item list. This conditional, which I've just added, has been added as a child of this item here. And the reason was I had this item selected when I added the node. So the node gets added in the item list as a child of the selected item. But if I hit spacebar to drop my selection, and I now add another conditional node, well, that's appeared in the schematic, but it hasn't appeared in the hierarchy here in the item list. And if you think about it, this is perfectly logical. Because I didn't have any items selected when I added the node to the schematic, Modo simply doesn't know where to place this new node in the item list. Whereas when I did have an item selected, it automatically placed the new node as a child of the selected item. But in this case, it doesn't know where to put it because I had nothing selected. So what it's actually done is added it underneath the scene item. If you go to the scene item and look for this little plus sign and just expand this, there's a whole bunch of nodes in here, and the node that I've just added is found here. And this, of course, is what caused my rig to break when I saved my assembly, because I wasn't saving the entire rig. So to demonstrate this again, let's just collapse this, double click on this softbox item to select everything, and I'll select these constraints that are found here. Let me just expand the item list and select everything. I think there's another one here. Go to my shader tree, hold down Shift, select all the shaders. Okay, so once again, I can see that in theory I should have everything selected, but yet in the schematic view there's some items that are not selected. So let me expand this plus sign, and I can see that indeed there's a whole bunch of nodes here that I hadn't been selected because they weren't part of the original hierarchy. And this happens very naturally when you're working in the schematic. You don't always have something selected when you add a node. You quite often just add a node and then connect it by hand. So the problem I had when I tried to reload this assembly was actually very basic. I simply hadn't selected all of the items that I needed to have selected in order for the rig to work, which is why it was broken when I reloaded it into the next scene. So this time I can be a little bit more thorough, because now that I've expanded the scene item itself to reveal all of these orphan nodes, I can make sure that they're all selected. I'm also going to go through in the schematic and just make sure that I've got all of these yellow dots expanded. I just double click on each yellow dot to reveal the nodes that are connected. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly pause the video while I just go through and make sure that all of this schematic view is tidied up and I've got absolutely everything selected before saving my assembly. So I've gone through and I've expanded all of the nodes that were hidden, and I've still got all my items in my item list selected. I'm going to make sure I've got all my shader tree items selected as well. And finally, holding down Shift, I'm going to draw a marquee in the schematic view just to select all of these nodes. So now I'm pretty hopeful that I've got everything selected. So I'm going to right click once again in the item list, and I'm going to go to Save Assembly, and I'm simply going to overwrite the assembly that I wrote earlier. And now for the moment of truth, or more than likely the moment of not truth, because it's almost certainly not going to work. But I'm going to create a new scene, and I'm going to open my preset browser, and I'm going to double click to load my test softbox. And let me just quickly test the controls. Let's try a really basic one. Already I can see that that's broken, but let's open a preview window and just see what it looks like. Yes, indeed, I can see it's still broken. So essentially, all this has been to demonstrate that when you've got a rig as complex as this, you simply cannot save it from the item list, even if you're really thorough and have everything selected. Now, having everything selected is a crucial step, but there is one final step that you need to do, and that is to save your assembly from the schematic rather than the item list. So I'm going to demonstrate exactly how to do that in the next step. So I've returned to my original softbox asset, and the first thing I do now is talk about workspaces, because they are actually a very little known feature, but they're actually pretty crucial when it comes to successfully saving assemblies that have complex nodal networks in them. And it's just an aspect of Modo that isn't very well documented. I think what everyone tends to do, and I was guilty of exactly the same thing, is that when you're building a nodal network or a rig, you just work in the schematic view, in the default workspace, because it just seems the natural thing to do. Well, this is a mistake. If you're going to try and save your rigs as assemblies, you actually need to create a custom workspace for this. So I'll show you how to do this. And obviously, if you've started working in the schematic, just in the default workspace, don't panic, because it's very easy to simply move your nodes into a custom workspace that you go on to create. So to start with, I'm going to click on this icon here with the 6 little rectangles, and that's going to take me to the top level view of the schematic. And what I'm going to do is click on this icon here at the far left, and I'm going to create a new workspace, and I'm going to call it softbox underscore assembly underscore work space. So that's created a new workspace, and this is where all of my rigging for my softbox is going to live. So now I simply need to take all of the rigging that I've created for my softbox and move it into this new workspace I've just created. So I'm just going to double click on the default workspace to go back to my rig, and I'm going to marquee select everything in this nodal network, and then I'm just going to zoom in so I can go over one of the nodes, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to go move nodes to, and I'm going to select my new softbox assembly workspace and move everything in there. And once again, I can click on the icon with the 6 rectangles, and that takes me back up to the top level. And if I now double click on my newly created workspace, you can see that all my nodes are now in there. So creating a custom workspace is the first of 2 crucial steps I need to do in order to successfully save this assembly with all the rig fully working. The next thing I need to do is just to be absolutely certain that everything that I need to be included with the assembly is in this schematic workspace. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on this hierarchy as usual, and I'm going to select everything in this hierarchy, and I'm going to go to the scene level item and select all of these orphaned nodes as well. Oops, let me undo that and just do it with Control. And I'm going to click on Add Selected here, just to make sure that there's no stray sort of items that have been omitted. You can see that when I did it, it added this item here. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing in the shader tree. So let me just shift click on this to expand everything. And I'm going to hold shift, select all of this, and once again in the schematic inside my softbox assembly workspace, I'm going to click Add Selected. That's just to make sure that I've got everything I need in this workspace in the schematic view. And once everything is added to the workspace, I'm going to hit spacebar to drop my selection, and I click on the 6 rectangles icon again. And I'm going to select my softbox assembly workspace, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to go save assembly from here. And this time I'm going to call it schematic softbox. And one final time, let's put it to the test. So I'm going to create a new scene, and I'm going to open my preset browser, and I'm going to locate my schematic softbox, double click on it and load it into the scene. And this time, if I open my preview, you can see that it looks exactly as it should. And if I test the controls, everything works pretty much as you would expect. All the rigging has basically survived. So that's really good news. And there's one more little nicety about saving the assembly this way. If I go to my top level, my schematic view, and I open my schematic workspace, you can see that this time the nodal network has survived in the exact same form as when I created it. We don't have all the nodes one on top of the other. And so from this demonstration, you can see that when you've got a very simple assembly you want to save, using the item list is perfectly fine. But when you've got something more complex with a rig, and especially when you've got something with nodes, you really need to be saving it from the schematic. You want to be saving it from the top level here. You need to create a new workspace, have all of your nodes in there, Make sure that you've selected absolutely every element in your scene that needs to be included with the assembly, and you right click and you save it from the schematic view rather than the item list. And when you do this, you have a much nicer assembly. Everything works, your nodes are in the same order and the same layout as when you created them, and you'll find that your rigging is going to work reliably. Whereas when you try and save a complex assembly from the item list, it's just not going to work. And the final point that I'd like to make is that you should get in the habit of, whenever you're creating a new rig and a new set of nodes, you should create a new assembly workspace for them. This means that you'll be able to keep everything nicely organized and separated from each other, that you're not working in the default workspace. And it also means that when it comes to saving your assemblies, your rigs as assemblies, you can save them very easily from the schematic view. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you very much for watching.